name is Lauren. Like Sierra said, I teach the Bible generally to middle schoolers. This week, I've got middle schoolers, and I'm doing art camp in the morning. So I've got like a 5 through 11-year-old range, which is super wild. They're all different things going on in their minds. And then, I like to bebop around, but I'm so excited to be here. A lot of you guys, I've had the honor and privilege of kind of seeing you guys come through 2020. When I was in middle school and high school, I did not go to 2020 and Omega. That's the middle school group, is 2020. I would go maybe once every couple of months, but for the most part, I was a main service girl. And so if you like main service, it's all good. We turn out okay too. Tonight, we're going to be diving into the book of Exodus, continuing on through the series you guys are walking through. But I want to kind of set the scene first to talk about this concept of like being let down. Has anybody in your life ever feel like you've been let down by anything? Dane's like, absolutely, all the time. Awesome. So like 3 of you guys have been let down. Let's try. Anybody ever been let down by anything? I'm going to give you like 3 rapid fire things that I've been let down by in the past several years. 1, Crumbl cookies. I really like a good old classic sugar cookie. Everybody's hyping Crumbl up. Everybody's like, this is the best cookie ever. I go to Crumbl and I get that like pink sugar cookie, and it's like there's like almond extract in it, and I have like how some people like get really weirded out by like when their tongue touches cilantro. That's how I feel about almond extract. So I was like incredibly let down by Crumbl cookies. They have other good cookies. Marilyn's horrified. She's like, I love almond extract. Well, I like the nut, but not the extract. Another thing, Titanic, the movie Titanic. Like everybody's like, this is the greatest like American classic. Like you have to see Titanic. And then I watch it and I'm like, that was fine. Like I never need to see that again, but it's fine. Sorry, these are hot takes. The third thing, yeah, you guys can have your own takes on Titanic. Third thing, who's been to the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk? Awesome, amazing. I love the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. It's one of my favorite places. Downside, the lines are always incredibly long if you're like a ride person. And so I went to the boardwalk a few years ago, and there's like the haunted house ride, and I swear we waited like 90 minutes for this haunted house ride, and it's like a 2-minute ride, and it's just like you're in this dark room the whole time, and there's like 3 fluorescent painted ghosts, and it was an absolute letdown. I would consider myself somebody who is very easily let down by things. Like when things don't go my way, when things don't go exactly how I want them to or exactly how I planned them to, I feel hurt. I feel like attacked. And so tonight I'm going to talk about a guy named Moses, who you guys have been talking about, I think for the past couple of weeks. And Moses is a guy who is well acquainted with being let down, with things not going the way that he's planned. The story of Exodus, does anybody know what the word Exodus means? Maybe you guys have gone over this. Yeah, exactly. So when we talk about the Exodus, or even as we sing this song, like the Exodus story is all about these Hebrew people, God's people, their exodus or their exit from the land of Egypt. But if you're joining us tonight and you've been here the last couple of weeks and you don't know anything about what that looks like, all you would know is that right now, the Hebrew people are being enslaved by the Egyptians. Where we're at in the story, God's people, who I'm going to refer to as the Hebrews or the Israelites or the Jews, those are God's chosen people, they are in slavery right now. They're under the thumb of oppression by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And so Exodus is this story of this exit of these slaves out of Egypt. But while we're leading up to that, what you've probably already walked through is like God creates the world. He creates everything in perfection. Humanity is the crown of his creation. That's like the creme de la creme. Like, I am creating you in my image, he said to humanity. Adam and Eve, the first humans, they choose to believe a doubt that this serpent instills in their heads. Did God really say you shouldn't do this one thing? They act upon that doubt. They act upon this lie. And because of that, humanity falls into sin. And so for hundreds of years, as we approach the story of the Hebrew people in slavery in Egypt, what we're seeing is God's people, the ones that he chose, who are called the Hebrews or the Israelites. He had told this guy Abraham, I'm making a promise to you, this covenant. Your descendants are gonna be as vast as the grains of sand on the seashore. He tells Abraham, there's this promised land, you're going to get to this place, and the land is going to be flowing with milk and honey, which to us, that sounds kind of weird, but to those people, that was like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for the milk and honey. And so these people, the Israelites, they're made this covenant with God, and they're promised that this thing's going to happen, but as they're living life and as they're continuing to believe lies about God instead of acting in response to the truth of who God is, we see that over and over and over again, these Israelite people, God's chosen people, they're letting God down. They're acting in ways that God is asking them not to. And so over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament, which is like the first 3/4 of the Bible, we see so much of that book is God calling people back to covenant, saying, look, this is the promise I made. This is the good thing coming. Just trust in it. And over and over and over again, people are acting in disappointing ways. Moses, he was disappointed too. If you were here last week, Austin probably talked about a burning bush. Moses had kind of a wild life. He was raised in Egyptian royalty, but he was of Hebrew descent. So at a time when Pharaoh was killing all of the young Hebrew boys because there were just too many Hebrew people, too many of God's people in his land, Moses escaped this death. He was raised in Egyptian royalty in the Pharaoh's own household. And so throughout Moses' entire life, he's wrestling with this identity crisis. He's like, I'm raised in this Egyptian household. I know the Egyptian tradition. I know the Egyptian gods. I know the Egyptian lingo. I fit in with this group because this is how I've been raised. But my blood and my skin and everything about me screams that I'm one of God's people whom Pharaoh's oppressing. And so Moses, his whole life, he's wrestling with this identity crisis. One day he's going along and he sees his people being oppressed. He sees a slave driver hurting one of his relatives, a Hebrew person. Moses kills that slave driver, and when he finds out that somebody saw the crime he had committed, he runs away. He runs to a place called Midian. He joins this family of a guy named Jethro, and Jethro is this priest. If you've ever seen Prince of Egypt, he's like a super jolly fellow. Like, he's so fun. He looks super fun. And they're like, da-na-na-na-na-na-na. I went to a wedding recently, and they all like danced in a circle to that song. It's awesome. And so Moses joins this family. He's run away from his problems. He's out of Egypt. The identity crisis is like, I've got my new identity. Like, I'm in Jethro's family. I'm part of this Midianite group. And God appears to him in a burning bush and asks him to come back to the land of Egypt, the place he's left far behind him, the place he's run away from, the place where he murdered somebody. And God asks him to come back to Egypt and says that Moses is going to be the one who's going to deliver God's people out of slavery in Egypt, who's going to lead them from Egypt toward the promised land. And so tonight, this is where we're going to pick up. At the end of Exodus 4, it says that God calls Moses and his brother Aaron to go to the elders. That's like the people who were leading the Hebrews in Egypt, the guys who were trusted by all of the Hebrew people. God calls Moses and his brother Aaron to go to these elders and tell them that what they're going to do is they're going to approach Pharaoh, and they're going to ask Pharaoh, like, hey, is it cool if we take a few days off and go worship God in the wilderness? This is what God asked of them. He said, I need you guys to bring all of the Hebrew people into the wilderness, worship me for a few days, and then you can go back to Egypt. And so Moses tells these elders that this is what he's going to ask of Pharaoh. And at the end of Exodus 4, it says that the elders, they were excited. They were thinking, man, the time of deliverance has come. This is happening right now. This is exciting. And they're miserable under Pharaoh's thumb. They're miserable in the oppression of Egypt. And it says in the scripture at the end of Exodus 4 that God sees their misery. And they see that God sees their misery and they worship God. And so what the story we're about to jump into in Exodus 5, Moses and Aaron are going to ask Pharaoh if they can take a few days off to go worship the Lord in the wilderness. And what happens is they make this request and Pharaoh laughs in their face. He's like, there is no way I'm going to let you take these people, all of your people, like your thousands of people, and go worship in the wilderness. Like, Pharaoh is completely baffled by how they could think that would be a possibility, a thought that would cross his mind. His heart is completely hardened to this idea. And Pharaoh then, he imposes this new level of oppression for the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people, their main job was to make bricks. At this time in Egypt, like architecture and structural building and building religious relics to various gods, this was like their thing. And so the Hebrew people, their whole thing was making bricks that could be used to build these structures. And what Pharaoh does is he says, I'm gonna kick it up a notch because that was so outrageous of you to ask. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make it so that when you're making these bricks, we're not even gonna give you the straw to make the bricks. You're gonna have to do twice as much work. You're gonna have to go out into the wilderness, collect the straw, bring it back, build the bricks. And Pharaoh was imposing this higher quota on these people, saying, Hebrew people, you're gonna have to do more. You're gonna have to work harder in order to meet the requirements that we're putting upon you. And the Hebrew overseers who are kind of managing these slaves as they're doing their work, they're infuriated. They're so angry at Moses and at Aaron for making this request to Pharaoh because now these slave drivers are breathing down their necks and their quotas are higher and their people are getting beaten more than they've ever gotten beaten before because of this request that Moses and Aaron make. And this is where we're going to jump in. If you have a Bible, you can open to Exodus 5. We're going to be starting in verse 19. And if you're looking for it, it is the second book of the Bible, so it's going to be pretty early on. But this is Exodus 5, 19 through 23 that we're going to read together. It says this: the Israelite foremen, that's those Hebrew overseers, they could see that they were in serious trouble when they were told, you must not reduce the number of bricks you make each day. As they left Pharaoh's court, they confronted Moses and Aaron, who were waiting outside for them. The foreman said to them, may the Lord judge and punish you for making us stink before the Pharaoh and his officials. You've put a sword into their hands, an excuse to kill us. Then Moses went back to the Lord and protested, why have you brought all this trouble on your own people, Lord? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh as your spokesman, he has been even more brutal to your people, and you've done nothing to rescue them. These are Moses' words to God. See, just like us, Moses' biggest fear when God asks him to do something is that God won't follow through. Or that God is going to disappoint him, or God's going to let him down, or he's not going to see the fruit of whatever it is that God asked him to do. When God asks us to do something, the reason that we act in opposition to God, the reason we sometimes look at God and say, I'm going to do my own thing instead, it is because we think that God does not have the best plans for us. And so Moses looks at God, he cries out to God, and he says, you are letting me down. Why did you even send me here? You're not helping your people at all. Your plan is failing. And these are heavy words to say to the God of the universe. But up until this point, this is likely the low point of Moses' life. He's had this identity crisis he's wrestled with. He has murdered somebody. He's run away from home. He's had a lot of things happen in his life. But nowhere else up until this point in Moses' story have we seen this kind of anger in a confrontation with the Lord. He's more torn up than ever about this confrontation he just had with Pharaoh and with these Hebrew overseers. And so he brings this new confrontation to the Lord. This God who he serves, this God who he's been completely obedient to, this God who he's given up the good life for, like he was married and in this tribe in the wilderness, like escaping all of his problems. And in obedience, he comes back, he does the thing that God asks him to do. He does every single thing that God asks him to do. And God lets him down. Moses is following God's plan. He goes back to Egypt. He does the miracles. He makes the plea to Pharaoh, and God does the opposite of what Moses thought would happen. So the question I want to wrestle through tonight is what happens when we feel like we're doing God's plan, but it causes us pain? When what we think should be the best laid plans in our lives, what we think is obedience to God and he's got a good life and a good path set before us, if only we just do what he says, what happens when that really hurts us? When the rolling out of God's plans doesn't go how we think they're going to go? I want to talk about some pain points of God's plans tonight, some realities that might come with following Jesus that we can't not talk about. The first, if you're looking at the screen, is that things often get worse before they get better. For Moses and the Hebrew people, this was true. As a result of Moses' obedience, things had gotten harder. Things had gotten worse for the Israelites who were living in Egypt. They're experiencing greater suffering as a result of Moses' obedience to God. Moses is feeling the effects of that personally. People are coming up to him and blaming him and saying, you're the one who caused this suffering. Why would you go to Pharaoh and do that? This is a low point for Moses because everybody is mad at him. If you're anything like me, sometimes that's the worst pain we can feel is when other people are mad at us, when other people are upset with us, when we feel like we're ruining things for other people. And this is what Moses is feeling. Moses goes back to God and he says, I don't understand. I'm doing exactly what you told me. Why is this happening? And for millennia of believers, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, things have gotten harder. Life has gotten harder when people have chosen to follow God. Missionaries go into places of persecution, people who are called to go serve God and share the good news of who Jesus is in other countries, in places where they could get killed or beaten or burned alive. Life gets harder sometimes when we say yes to God's plans for us. Sometimes God might call us to leave a relationship, to break up with that person, or to say goodbye to that friend group. And it feels hard, and we wonder, God, why would you take me out of that? Why would you take away that one person, the person I loved the most? Why would you do that? Sometimes God asks us to leave places of success, like a soccer team or a basketball team where you're thriving, you're the top person on that team, and if God calls you out of that. That happens. God calls his people to some wacky things sometimes. And sometimes when this happens, when things get worse before they get better, we try to take things into our own hands. We get upset with God, so we start to do our own thing. We think because it's not working out, because we were obedient to God, and the way that the plan's rolling out isn't how we expected, we start to put our identity in other things. This is called idolatry. It's where we take matters into our own hands and we make ourselves a god, or we make someone else a god, and we say, God, your plan isn't good enough, so I'm going to let somebody else run the course of my life. The Hebrew people would do this over and over and over again throughout this Exodus story. If you stick around Omega, which I really hope you do, you're going to see that over and over and over again, every single time things don't go their way, every single time God calls the Hebrew people to do something, and they do it, and they're upset with what God does next, they're going to turn to other things. Grumpiness and idolatry is going to mark the Hebrew people. Stick around and you will see that. They take control and they try to make their own gods, or they try to make themselves a god. And people make really terrible gods. You make a really terrible god. There's one being in all of eternity who is equipped to be a god, and he is. And when we take matters into our own hands, things never work out. Another pain point of God's plan is that our vision is limited. We can't see the future. We can't see the next day. We can't see the next response. We are finite humans who are created by a good and infinite God. We're created in God's image and likeness. It tells us that in Genesis 1:26 and 27. But we don't have the vast capabilities that God possesses. See, Moses doesn't know a lot at this point. His vision is limited when he cries out to God. If you know anything about the Exodus story, I'm going to spoil a little bit. Just how when I said to my first graders today, I told them, you are a sinner and you deserve death, and some of them started to cry. I had to follow that up with we're going to talk about Jesus the next 3 days, you have a way out. And so, I'm going to spoil a little bit of the story for the purpose of this making sense. Yeah, scary. Talk to me about it later if that causes questions. Let's remember what Moses does not know at this point. In his limited vision, Moses does not know that 10 plagues are coming to completely rock the land of Egypt, because that hadn't been revealed to him yet. He doesn't have a clue that his nation will be brought across the Red Sea, that the very waters of the vast Red Sea would split open before him. Moses doesn't know that there's going to be this golden calf at Mount Sinai that the Hebrew people are going to worship, or that there would be unending complaints in the wilderness coming. All that is hidden in the mists of the future. What Moses is dealing with is that he has to go back to Pharaoh. What Moses is dealing with is what he sees as God's failed plan. If Moses has any hope of doing it all what God wants him to do, he has to go talk to Pharaoh again. He knows that. Given how poorly he was received the first time, I'm sure this wasn't a confrontation that he was looking forward to. But you can't just bypass a part of the journey to get to the good part. Moses is never going to get to Mount Sinai where he'll receive the 10 Commandments without first passing through the Red Sea. He's never going to get to the Red Sea if he doesn't go watch the 10 plagues unfold first. And he can't watch the 10 plagues unfold unless he first goes to Pharaoh and makes these requests again. Let my people go. He'll never make it back to Pharaoh unless he ignores his critics. And I think that's important for us to know too. There are confrontations and things that God is calling us into. And if we're so concerned about the voices around us, we are never, ever going to get to the place where God's going to split the sea for us. God will always make a way. It does not depend on Moses. It doesn't depend on these Hebrew people. But Moses isn't going to get to witness that unless he takes these steps for God. Our vision is limited. That makes us doubt God's timing. We wonder how God could possibly be good when everything we love is being taken away from us. We wonder how God could be good when our dreams are dying or our hopes are falling apart before us. We might begin to question God's character when it seems he didn't show up in the way we thought he would. We may become disheartened. We forgo the bravery of believing that while we're waiting, God is working. And the third and final pain I want to talk about of God's plan is that there may be disappointment. And it's common when we experience disappointment in anything for that to lead to doubt. Moses is extremely disappointed. Aaron is disappointed, his brother. The Hebrew people are disappointed. This God, who they're here to follow, the people who God has chosen to be his own, are extremely disappointed that their God isn't coming through for them. Disappointment leads to doubt, and doubt usually paves the way for believing lies. For Moses, in his disappointment, he cries out to God, like we read it at the end of Exodus 5 there, and he says things like, I'm not the man for the job. Like, you chose the wrong guy. It's not me. The other lies he believes, he believes lies like God is not going to come through, or Egypt is just too strong. They have way too much military power. They're way too big. We'll never defeat them. Moses is disappointed. That disappointment leads to doubt, and the doubt makes a way for lies to come in. And meanwhile, in the meantime, God is like, I'm moving. God is telling Moses, this is who I am. Get ready for what's on the way. But Moses and his friends, the Hebrew people, they're just super grumpy and bummed. This would mark these people. When we meet doubt, lies come in. This has been true since the beginning of time. I talked about this creation story. Man and woman in perfect harmony in the Garden of Eden, and this serpent comes in, and the first words out of the serpent's mouth are did God really say this? Doubt enters their mind, and that doubt makes ways for lies. Like, I don't think God has the best plans for me. I don't think I need to do what God says. I think what the serpent is saying might actually be better and have more for me than what God's saying. And Adam and Eve in the garden, they didn't even have anything to be disappointed in. They were walking in harmony with God. It says that they could eat from any fruit they wanted to, and the fruit looked really good. I'm sure it tasted really good too. They had nothing to be disappointed in. It would be a huge bummer, I think, if our temporary circumstances made us turn away from God, but it happens all the time. We leave off here with Moses crying out in unmet expectations to God. In Exodus 5:22 and 23, it says, Moses returned to the Lord and said, Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on the people, and you have not rescued your people at all. I got stung by a bee on the foot on Saturday. I stepped on a bee. Has anybody ever stepped on a bee? Okay, 2 of us. Cool. You can put your hands down. I was just walking around the front yard. Actually, I was having an Olympic-themed birthday party for my brother, and one of the Olympic events was cornhole. And I'm walking around, and I step on this bee, and it hurt. Like, it was painful. And so I sat on a bench. Didn't cry, not to brag, but I sit on a bench. And there's this like little red mark, and like stinger was all gone. Phew. And my friend came over, and she had gotten some ice from inside my parents' house, and she gave me the ice pack, and I put it on where the sting was, and it like relieved the pain. Like the pain just went away. And we're talking about these pain points of what it means to follow God's plan. Like, there will be disappointment. Our vision is limited, whatever the first one was. Like, there are these pain points that come when we follow God's plan. And I think of that ice pack and how I had this pain point in my foot where a bee's stinger had injected me with whatever it does. And this ice pack just like, it soothed the pain right there. And so what I want to spend the next few minutes in the last kind of part of our time together talking about are the salves of God's plan. There are these pain points. There are things that cause us pain. But a salve, everybody say salve. It's the same root of salvation, saving. A salve is something that soothes pain or heals a wound. And so for me, when I stepped on this bee, this ice pack was a salve for me. It soothed the pain that I was feeling. And I think it's really cool because there are salves for the pains that we feel in God's plan too. We talked about this pain that things often get worse before they get better. This is a pain point of God's plan. And I think the salve to that God gives us is that his power works best in our weakness. We should not be alarmed if life gets harder when we're trying to do God's will. We should not be surprised when things get hard when we're obedient to God. This is exactly what happened for the Hebrew people. This is exactly what happened for John the Baptizer when he was arrested and killed, and Christians in the book of Revelation, the churches that are listed in Revelation. For Jeremiah the prophet and Noah and Jonah, things got harder, things got worse before they got better. And God tells us that his power is a power that is made perfect, that works best in our weakness. And I wonder what would change if we truly believed that weakness was the way. Like if we truly believed that when we're in a moment of weakness, that's actually where God is going to show up and do more than he ever could do. That being a valley was a necessary place to experience the fullness of God's power. I'm reading a book called The Way of the Dragon or The Way of the Lamb. It's a good book. And I love this quote that the author writes about being a valley, being a low place. He says, God invites us into the valley. The question is whether we will accept the invitation. The valley will always be in the shadow of the mountains. The mountains with their dramatic peaks and pillars to the clouds will always appear more special to the world around you. Becoming a valley is truly humbling, and yet this is the place where the rain soaks deep and fruit is truly produced. The valley is the place of life. It's the place of kingdom power. Paul talks about a thorn in his flesh that the Lord had given him in 2 Corinthians 12, and he writes this. Paul writes, "But he, the Lord, said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me.'" For the Hebrew people, they were furious with Moses and Aaron for beseeching the Pharaoh to let them worship in the wilderness. For Moses and Aaron, they were furious at the Pharaoh for rejecting them, and they were furious at God for having a bad plan. And in the Lord's response to Moses, the verses that we're going to read in just a sec are going to show us so much about God's character, about how he is the God whose power is made perfect in our weakness. I think we'll have Exodus 6, 1 through 9 on the screen. Exodus 6, 1 through 9, if you have a Bible, you can read it from there. But it says this, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. When he feels the force of my strong hand, he will let the people go. In fact, he'll force them to leave this land.' And God said to Moses, 'I am Yahweh the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, God Almighty, but I did not reveal my name Yahweh to them.'" Might be different. "And I reaffirmed my covenant with them. Under its terms, I promised to give them the land of Canaan, where they were living as foreigners. You can be sure that I've heard the groans of the people of Israel, who are now slaves to the Egyptians, and I'm well aware of my covenant with them. Therefore, say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will free you from your oppression and will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I'm the Lord your God, who's freed you from your oppression in Egypt. I'll bring you back into the land I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as your very own possession. I am the Lord." And I love how this ends. "So Moses told the people of Israel what the Lord had said, but they refused to listen anymore. They'd become too discouraged to the brutality of their slavery." Like, they're just like, whatever, man. That was a cool speech. That's wild to me. In the Lord's response to Moses, the verses we just read, God is hitting them with over and over again, "I will, I am," over and over. "I will bring you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. I'll deliver you from slavery. I'll redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. I'll take you to be my people. I'll be your God. I'll bring you into the land I swore to give you as your possession." Notice how it ends in verse 8. God says, "I am the Lord." That is who God is. Who is God that we should obey him? This is the description of who God is. 7 times God says, I will, in his response to Moses. It's all God. And Christ's power is made perfect in our weakness. God works best in our weakness because it's never really been about God's people at all. It's never really been about God's people following through and living out and making happen God's plan. It's always been about the God who will and the God who can and the God who is. He says, I am the Lord. He reminds Moses of his character. He says, these are the things I am going to do, because it was never about people who would bend to Moses and Aaron's requests and wills. It was always about the God who would make a way through no matter what the people did. It was all God, and he was going to do it because he was the Lord. The second pane of God's plan that we talked about is that our vision is limited. Good news, people, our next salve, when our vision is limited, we rest in the reality that his vision is unlimited. The one who's authoring the plans and giving us the plans and telling us what to do and how to obey him and live life within his will, he also knows exactly how the plans are going to go. And I think that's enough for us just to be done tonight. That's really, really good news that God knows what's going to happen next. But I love that in 1 Corinthians 13:12, Paul writes this, for now we humans see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then, in the future, we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. And I love those last 6 words because Paul is writing about this future time, this heavenly time, when everything will be made clear, when everything will make sense, when we'll see what the plan meant all along, when we'll see why the pains that we were caused. But even in this scripture, Paul writes in those last 6 words, even as I am fully known, there is a God who, in the midst of us only being able to see fractured reflections, like puzzle pieces that are thrown at, like a puzzle that's literally just thrown into the air, and we just see these pieces sitting on the ground. Paul acknowledges that there's a God who sees it all. He acknowledges that there's a God who fully knows him, who knows everything. God's vision is unlimited. We can't see everything. When I was a kid, I had a grandpa. And, when I was a kid, I had 2 grandpas. One of my grandpas, Grandpa Gary, he one time asked me, I was probably 5 years old. I don't even remember it, but people have told me this story, so it's probably true. Grandpa Gary came up to me, and he's like, would you rather have 5 pennies or $1? And I was like, 5 pennies, quantity, why would I want 1 of something when I could have 5 of something? And what I didn't know at the time, obviously, is that $1 is 20 times more valuable than 5 pennies. And so I took the 5 pennies, and my Grandpa Gary made fun of me to everybody, and that's probably why they tell me the story. But you guys, when I was a kid, I just didn't know any better. There was a time in my life where I did not know that $1 was more valuable than 5 pennies, and my grandpa was a trickster. He took advantage of little grandchildren like me in that specific way. Come on, people. Is this what cancel culture is? You just take a little piece and you're like, she's out. No. This is what my Grandpa Gary did. He was a swindler. But you guys, God is not a swindler. He's not in the business of withholding good things or tricking us. When he gives us something, when he calls us to something, there's a reason for that. There's a purpose for that. God is not tricky like my Grandpa Gary. God is God and we are not. And so in the midst of a puzzle that we can't quite figure out, in the midst of only seeing reflections of the full picture, God is saying to us, you are going to see what I'm doing. He's saying this to Moses. He's saying this to us today. Summarized in verse 2, God says, I am the Lord. Verse 3, he says, others knew my name, but you're going to see what my name means when I take you through to Pharaoh, when I act against Pharaoh. So we react in times where our vision is limited, but we trust that God's vision is unlimited. We react by trusting that God's going to move more than we can imagine. Consider for a second the possibility that God's plans for you are greater than the greatest plans you could ever dream of for yourself. God is at work in all of our circumstances, even when we can't see what's happening. His power works best in our weaknesses. He has unlimited vision when we do not. Even the painful experiences we have, even the disappointments, the crippling, crushing weight of the world, he wants more for us than we could ever want or imagine. So what if we just stopped asking why and started asking, what can I learn? It's not going to change the situation. Neither answer to that question, to those questions, are going to change our circumstances, but it might change us. It shifts our attitude from being people who are victims to being people who are victors. It changes our perspective from earthly things to eternal things. And it allows us to, that what was meant to harm us, God will use to help us. The third and final major pain of God's plan that's felt by us and by Moses and Aaron and the Hebrew people is that there may be disappointment. This is huge. This is where we're going to just finish up tonight. There may be disappointment. That is a pain of God's plan. While there may be a pain of disappointment, I think the salve that we see is that there is a depth. Depth is why I started following Jesus in the first place. I didn't go to Omega in 2020. I grew up right here at Three Crosses. Woohoo. I grew up here going to Three Crosses, and I didn't really go to Omega or 2020, but I had this group of friends who went to Castro Valley High School with me, and they went to Omega. They were, I don't really know because I didn't attend, but I think they were like the cool Omega girls. Marilyn was probably their leader or something, so she's, or like saw them from afar. Yeah, they were cool Omega girls, and one day, they knew I was a Christian, they knew I went to church here, and one day they started this Bible study, and they invited me to come to this Bible study at one of their houses, and there was no leader, and there was no plan, we were just freestyling. We were just a group of women gathering to read the Bible, but I didn't want to go to Omega, and I didn't go to 2020. I went to this Bible study, and depth is what brought me into really following Jesus and trusting him with my life. Sorry, it's a cool purse thing. Bag, crossbody. Depth is what brought me to really know Jesus. Because when I was in high school, there were really hard things going on in my life at home. My parents were separated. My dad was going to rehab for alcohol addiction. And I gathered with this group of people with no adult leader. It was just a bunch of high school girls. And we just read the Bible and talked about it. And they did this thing called prayer requests where you can tell people things that are going on in your life and invite them to know them or talk to God about them or something. And I remember I didn't speak first. Okay, I was so uncomfortable. They knew the words to worship songs and they knew Bible references and I didn't know anything. And I remember they just started talking in this prayer request time about real things going on in their lives, things that my friends at school and I had never talked about, things I never talked about with my parents, like things that they were feeling and things that were going on in their heads and hard parts of relationships or hard parts of family life at home and the weights that they were feeling of the brokenness of the world. And I remember it literally that is the moment that those were the moments where I really decided this is what I want to be about. It was Christian community that attracted me to the God of Christianity, that attracted me to Christ. I was drawn in by these people who had depth, these people who weren't content to just talk about gossip or talk about celebrities or things that my friends at school and I were always talking about and wasting our time, spending our lives, turning our focus to. There was something more to life that I could see in these people because they had something that I wanted to have. They had a relationship with Jesus that led them to a place of depth. I said there may be disappointment. There will always be disappointment. There will always be new things to disappoint you, whether that's Crumble Cookies or Titanic or the haunted ride at the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk or a friend letting you down, or a relationship not working out, or the feeling of rejection, or getting a bad grade on a test, or not making that team, or not getting that part. There's always going to be things to disappoint you. But there will always be an avenue for the Lord to use that to be a place of depth for you. For me, that was so true in my life. Disappointment, I think, actually has immense value. It takes us to a place of reality and honesty with God. And I actually don't think that Moses crying out in those verses saying, "Why did you do this, God? I can't believe you." I actually don't think that Moses' disappointment is sinful. I think that Moses bringing his honest feelings to God, I don't think that is where Moses missteps. I think where Moses missteps is when he forgets God's character. Moses missteps when he accuses God of being less than or something other than who God actually is. When Jesus goes to be arrested and he'll be crucified and murdered on a cross to take the weight of our sins, the night that he's arrested, he's crying out to God in a garden, and he's saying, "God, if it's in your will, would you take this cup of suffering away from me?" He begs God to remove this weight of suffering that's incoming, the pressure's closing in on him as he's going to walk to his death. And Jesus never sins, so we know that crying out to God in the midst of suffering is not sinful. Being disappointed in how life is turning out is not sinful. But where Moses and Jesus differ is that where Moses said, "God, you are not who you say you are. Jesus follows up, will you take away this cup of suffering from me, with, but if not, Lord, will your will be done? He, in the midst of his disappointment, he is still trusting in who God says he is. He's still trusting in his Father's character. This is so important for us to catch. And I want to end here on this word that is remembrance. Psalm 77 shows us that disappointment and depth can coexist. And a key part of that coexistence is this act of remembrance. Everybody say remembrance. That's really important. Psalm 77, verses 9 through 12. It's really tiny on my paper. Say, has God forgotten to be merciful? This is David, the man after God's heart speaking. He says, has God forgotten to be merciful? I feel like it looks silly. Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Then I thought, to this I will appeal. The years when the Most High stretched out his right hand, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. The salve of depth of our faith in Jesus intertwines with disappointment and remembrance. Remembering the God of the Bible. Remembering the God who has always made a way for his people. Remembering the God who, even when Moses is crying out saying, how could you do this? You chose the wrong guy for the job. I cannot believe you, God. That the same God is the one who's gonna lead Moses and the Hebrew people through the Red Sea, who's gonna part the waters and make a way for them to find freedom from this slavery. Remembrance is a huge theme of the Old Testament. Again, that's the first 3/4 of your Bible. We see this word remembrance, or a variant of the word remembrance, over 500 times. And rarely in the Bible is God being like, oh, I need to remember this thing. Like, overwhelmingly, the reason we see the word remembrance is because people are forgetting who God is and needing to be called back into knowing him, being called back into their covenant, being called back into the blessing plan that he has for them. Remembrance is such an important piece of the Bible. It's usually something for people to do because God doesn't really need to do it. And this is how souls were commanded in the days of old. This is how souls, I think, still should be commanded today. It is that when we forget who God is, when we start to be disappointed, when we start to doubt God and let lies seep in, just like throughout the scriptures, hundreds and hundreds of times, we need to be called back into a place of remembrance. And here's an equation I want you to remember. Disappointment plus remembrance equals depth of faith. A remembering practice of Christian people has been around for thousands and thousands of years. When disappointment meets remembrance, that they meet each other and lead to a place of greater faith. A faith that God will continue to do what he says he's going to do because he always has. A faith that trusts that even as we walk into the fire, he walks with us there. That he's still good because the fire is where he walked with Daniel's friends. And so as we close, I just want to think about this element of faith, this depth of faith that exists when we let our disappointment come to a place of remembrance. And if you're like me, it's often in the moments of disappointment when things are not turning out how we thought they'd turn out, that we most need to remember who God is, but those are also the moments where it's hardest to remember who God is. It's hard for Moses. He's forgetting. It's really hard to remember who God is when we're disappointed, especially when we're disappointed with God. And so something I want to encourage you guys to do is open this book and you're going to see who God is over and over again. When you cannot remember a single good thing God has ever done for you, that happens to me. When you can't think of anything good God's ever done for you, open this book and you'll see him doing good over and over again for his beloved creation, the people made in his likeness. Or when you forget who God is and you just can't bring yourself to open the Bible, trust a friend enough to say, I'm having trouble right now. Can you just tell me something good God's done in your life in the last few weeks? Or I'm having trouble right now. Can you just tell me, can you remind me who God is? That's a hard question to say to somebody. When I was growing up at Three Crosses, we do these baptism services on Sunday mornings. If you're following Jesus and you haven't been baptized, let's do it. And they would have 2 or 3 services at Three Crosses. And when I was younger, I would have my mom drop me off in the morning and I would watch all the baptism services because I loved hearing stories about how God had changed people's lives. There's something to hearing somebody else's story when we can't feel it ourselves, when we can't muster up the faith ourselves, when we're disappointed and angered at God and we're saying, God, you chose the wrong person. God, I don't want to be obedient to you. Or God, I did the thing that you asked me to do and it didn't turn out the way I thought it would. When we're mad at God, when we're frustrated at God, those are the best times to listen and hear what God's doing in other people's lives when we can't figure it out ourselves. Disappointment and remembrance together bring us to a place of a depth of faith. Faith is an important thing. It's not always an easy thing to just muster, like pick up our bootstraps and like get in the faith bubble. But there's some choice in our faith, but there's also a beauty in asking Jesus to help us when we don't feel like we have the faith ourselves. In Mark 9, a man in a crowd brings his demon-possessed son before Jesus. Actually says Jesus entered this conversation. He wasn't really invited into it. And the disciples were unable to drive out this evil spirit that was in this little boy. So the father asked Jesus to heal him. The father says, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, "everything's possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." And so as we go into this last worship song, I'll invite the worship team to come up here. We're going to sing one more song. And as we sing the song, I just want to invite you, if this is you tonight and you're in a place of disappointment or you're in a place of not being able to remember who God is, my invitation to you tonight is to be somebody who, as we sing this song, prays to God or asks God in your heart, "Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief." There are places for all of us where our faith needs to be strengthened, where we need to command our souls and invite Jesus to help us with that. And so as we sing this song, let's make that our prayer, to be people who are asking for a belief, for a faith when we feel like we lack that. I'm going to pray, and then we'll sing. Lord Jesus, I thank you for tonight, God. Thank you that you're a patient God. We're in no rush. God, I ask that as we sing this song, Lord, as we go into the rest of this night and this week, Lord, that our souls would just be invited to a place of belief, God. That even in the midst of our disappointments and doubts and lies that are filling our heads, Lord, I thank you that you're a God who comes through. I thank you that you're a God who invites us to the deepest places when we're in the lowest points of the valley, Lord. Thank you that you walk with us there. Thank you that you see us there. Thank you that your son Jesus made a way for us to be with you forever, God. Thank you that we don't have to face it alone. Thank you that you are a God to whom we can cry out, "Lord, I believe, would you help my unbelief?" God, as we sing this song, would you examine our hearts? Would you invite us to do the same? And would you just fill those places of unbelief with your love, with the remembrance of who you are and a trust in you. We love you, God. We ask these things in your name. Amen.